Hello, welcome to 30 Minutes. I'm Rick Anthony. With all the tumult in Washington and around the world, and President Trump usually in the thick of it, I often wonder how history will judge the Trump presidency. The man, the chief executive, the politician, the world leader. It takes years, sometimes decades, for a full retrospective to come into sharp focus. Mercifully, time often softens some of the sharp edges of a president's record. The immediacy of a president's term of office is tempered by the human instinct to want to move on. President Nixon was disgraced and impeached, but history lauded him for breaking through the bamboo curtain with China. President Clinton was disgraced and impeached, but history credits his transcending partisan politics to push through important economic and social reforms. In fewer than 4 years, President Trump has distinguished himself as the most iconoclastic, unpredictable, brashest, unorthodox, inconsistent, obnoxious, arrogant, narcissistic, egotistical, complex person who has ever sat in the Oval Office. Trump seems to have the classic messiah complex, but he does get things done, and he seems to have inexhaustible energy. One observer said Trump's unpredictable strength makes him personally dangerous, like plutonium. You don't know whether the plutonium will heat your home or blow up your town. No question that Trump keeps his friends and his enemies on edge. I don't consider myself a Trump apologist. I personally like much of what he has done and is doing, but often I have to separate commendation for good outcomes from condemnation for bad behavior, especially in the wake of his unbridled bravado following his impeachment acquittal. In an article I read a few months ago by a lifelong Republican, that article caught my attention. The author, Ken Davis, was formerly chairman of Montgomery County's Republican Party, president of the Lower Merion Commissioners, and as a younger man, chief of staff of Pennsylvania's venerable Republican Senator Hugh Scott. In the article, Ken contrasts the behavior of today's Republican leadership with that of almost a half century ago, when Senator Scott led a small delegation to urge President Nixon to resign in the face of overwhelming and indisputable evidence of impeachable offenses. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Thank you. MLTV.
Thank you.
I think we might start, because it's kind of the touchstone for our meeting today, our visit today, with at least the paragraph. I think it was the concluding paragraph from your October article. Mm-hmm. Could you read that for us, please?
Sure, thank you. The headline on the article was the GOP I knew from the Nixon era doesn't exist anymore. The concluding paragraph is, the Republican Party of today is not the Republican Party of 1974. Its core values and core positions on issues are now relics of the past. The base of the Republican Party today has answered Trump's call to nativism and isolationism, and it is this base that has sent these members of Congress to Washington to represent its narrow interests. It pains me to see how my party has devolved into cult worship of a man with no Republican principles. It doesn't have to be that way.
That was back in October, more than 4 months ago. Do you feel, given what's transpired since then, do you still feel as strongly about Trump and his behavior as you did then?
I feel more strongly. Mm-hmm. I think, having watched the impeachment proceedings in the House and in the Senate, watched listened to him speak over those four months, nothing's changed. If anything, I think it's gotten worse.
Hmm. So I think the time we're going to spend today is going to be a discussion not so much of whatever anyone would allege to be his accomplishments, but rather his style, the way he has done what he's done, and is likely to continue to do based on his acquittal, because he seems to have even more confidence than he had before, going into what looks as if it may be a second term. Before we get to that discussion, though, over the weekend I read Peggy Noonan's column. I don't always agree with her, but I really respect the way she writes. I'd like to read it, please, because it's somewhat reminiscent of your message as well. Quote, Democrats, when they're feeling alarmed or mischievous, will often say that Ronald Reagan would not recognize the current Republican Party. I usually respond that John F. Kennedy would not recognize the current Democratic Party and would never succeed in it. She goes on to say that Reagan and Kennedy came from different backgrounds, but at the time in a country with a shared national culture. She goes on, both men valued certain public behaviors in the maintenance of a public face. It involved composure, coolness, a certain elegance, and self-mastery. They felt they had to show competence and professionalism. They knew they were passing through history at an elevated level, and part of their job was to hold its ways and traditions. Their way is gone, maybe forever. Close quote. You and Peggy seem to be on the same page.
Absolutely. I wish I was as elegant as she is.
No, she is quite elegant. I love her writing style. She often sends me to the dictionary to look up some of the words she uses. Let's talk about how we've gotten to this point, though, and what and who can turn things around. You've been an observer as a Republican, part of the Republican establishment over the years. What happened?
Well, what happened was, I think, when you go back to Barry Goldwater in 1964, and that's a little bit before I was paying attention to politics. I was in college at the time, but I paid attention to it, and I began to see, what was going on. It wasn't until later that I really began to really pay attention to it. But it seemed to me at the time, at least in 64 and then in 68, there was still an element of conservatism, sort of right-wing politics, not nasty politics, but right-wing conservative politics that was sort of latent within the Republican Party. Goldwater brought that out to some extent. His defeat was so crushing, however, that I think that sentiment kind of went underground for a while. But with Trump, I think it has come back up full throttle. And I think he has tapped into a vein of discontent that's been sort of festering in the body politic for many years, and he just took advantage of that sentiment.
So in your view, has conservatism gone amok with what you describe as Trump's nativism and isolationism?
Well, Trump is not a conservative, and he's not a Republican. I mean, let's put it that way. That's not the way he started out. If you read some of the things that he said some years ago,
Reagan didn't start out as a Republican.
Reagan was a Democrat. I mean, I don't fault Trump for being a Democrat once and now a Republican. I mean, after all, he lived and worked in New York City, and he had to get along with New York City politicians. I'm just saying that none of the positions that he has now have been Republican positions in the past. The Republican Party has generally been, not all the time, pro-civil rights, pro-international trade, pro-internationalism, pro-Europe. All of that has changed, and it makes it difficult to identify Trump with either conservatism or republicanism.
But I think he would say, I'm for all of those things, but on our terms.
Well, his terms are somewhat ill-defined.
Not his terms, our terms.
Yeah,
the US.
no, but I think he's had difficulty defining things on his terms. He's impulsive. He does things without consultation with members of Congress, without consultation of his top leaders in the Pentagon, in the State Department, or even in the White House.
But given the acrimony that has existed between the president, the executive branch, and the Congress, could you realistically expect him to go back to the Congress, knowing full well that they're going to block, reject, and probably belittle anything he brings to them, as they have, in fact?
I got started on Capitol Hill in 1967. Lyndon Johnson was still president. People like Hugh Scott was joined by a number of other Republicans, moderates, mostly from the Northeast, Midwest, Far West, who were generally moderate in their positions, and certainly on civil rights. At that time, the South was solid Democrat, and they were all segregationists. They were against any kind of compromise on civil rights. Lyndon Johnson, to his credit, being a Southern Democrat from Texas, commandeered this group of Republicans to work with the Hubert Humphreys of the world to get the massive civil rights legislation of the 60s passed. So it's not unusual to see that. I saw it firsthand. People would not have thought that could have been the case, but Johnson made it work. I don't think Trump has the capacity to deal with people who have a different view than he has. And that's what makes life difficult for the White House and for Congress. But have we not been at a time, are we not now in a time,
where the country, maybe the world, needed a turnaround expert. And as I watch Trump, given 40 years of consulting in the corporate world and having worked with some turnaround experts over the years, those people, as you know from your own experience, I'm sure, those people are usually parachuted in to fix things. And that means they're going to break some things. They're going to be disruptors. I made a list of the characteristics of an effective turnaround expert. They're disruptive, they're tough-minded, they're decisive, they're intuitive, they're strategic and tactical, they're self-confident, they're optimistic, they're risk-takers, they're impatient, and they're involved. Like it or not, I think that list pretty well applies to Trump, at least the Trump we see.
The difference here is that you're talking about corporate
Yes.
characteristics. This is the United States government. The United States government does not act like a corporation. Trump's corporation was not on the New York Stock Exchange. It's a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump and his family.
So he did things his way.
So all of these wonderful characteristics that you can cite from the corporate world, and I've seen a lot of that myself, it doesn't work in government. Government does not turn on a dime. And when you try to turn it on a dime, there's massive disruption and distrust and unhappiness.
Wasn't Obama a turnaround expert? Didn't he, before he was elected, didn't he and Michelle announce to the world what their agenda was, exactly what they were going to do, and they did it? Just as Trump announced as part of his campaign, this is what I'm going to do.
If you talk,
And he is doing it.
yeah, if you talk to a lot of Obama supporters today, they will express disappointment in him that he didn't go far enough.
Yes.
I think he was tempered by the reality of the office, of having to work with a split Congress for at least a time. And he was smart enough to recognize that the only way to get anything done is to trim your sails a little bit. Every president has to do that to some extent. This guy doesn't do that, and that's what creates the disruption.
Isn't it possible, and again, I'm not a Trump apologist, I told you that, but isn't it possible that in a second term, if he has a second term, that he will begin to modify his behavior, will begin to understand that a different approach, different style is necessary, that now that he's broken things and he's trying to put them back together, he has to modify his approach and be somewhat more sensitive to the way people react to him, what they think of him? You're shaking your head. You don't think he's going to
I thought I was a pretty smart politician, and I thought I've seen it all. When he said that John McCain was not a war hero
Yeah.
because he was captured,
That was stupid.
I thought, well, okay, is this the direction that we're going? I haven't seen any change in this man since then. He refuses to apologize for anything. He will never admit defeat on anything. He will never admit fault on anything. And to think that he's going to change now, I think is folly. I mean, I think he thinks in his own mind, it's been working for me for 4 years,
Yeah.
and it will work for me for the next 4. He may be right, he may be wrong, but I think that's what he thinks, and I think time will tell.
Is there anyone that you can think of who's currently as part of his cabinet or close to him, if not in the cabinet, who might have some influence over him going into another term?
He has dismissed everyone in his White House and in his cabinet who did not agree with him on everything. He cannot abide people who don't say yes to him all the time. And you take a look at his Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, Chiefs of Staff, there's been several. Now, all of these people decided once in a while to tell him he can't do certain things, and they got fired. So this is a big reality TV show for him, I think, and he doesn't behave the way a president should be. Now, maybe you can get away with it in a corporation, but you can't get away with it in government.
So
It may work for him, but I don't see anybody around him currently who can do that. The ones who could have are gone.
I'm thinking about some, and I won't name their names, but I'm thinking about some of the more moderates in the Senate, Republicans in the Senate, who have, although they've been staunch supporters of Trump, seem to be more reasonable, seem to have better judgment, and hoping, wondering whether or not they might form a coalition in a second term, if there is one, to surround him and influence the way he behaves, maybe his policies as well, but more importantly, the way he behaves.
There are precious few of those people.
I agree.
And the only time they say what they say to mitigate some of the things that he does is in private. Woe be the day that you criticize him in public. But if you go to the White House and you have his confidence, you might be able to say some of those things to him in the privacy of the Oval Office. You cannot get away with it saying anything like that on the Sunday talk shows. So
you obviously shudder at the prospect of a second term?
Well, I go into it just not knowing what's going to happen. I mean, if the post-acquittal behavior is anything that we can expect to see in the future, assuming he's reelected, I think it'll be a pretty rocky road. I just don't know that he's got the capacity to change. Don't know whether he wants to change. Now that he's been acquitted in the Senate, or at least found not guilty.
Not exonerated.
Not exonerated. That's his word.
Yes.
He said it was one word. It's actually two words that he used, total exoneration. But the point is that he just doesn't have that capacity to change. And we've seen it since the not guilty verdict. If he's reelected in November, you'll see it again. And after that point, you'll see it even more so.
Yeah. He seems to feed on what he perceives as vindication of what he's done and the way he's done.
He's a man who's full of grievances. And he cannot let go of anything that's perceived to be a grievance. For somebody who's achieved an awful lot in his private life, he has a very thin skin. He's very inadequate when it comes to his own personality. I just don't think that he feels confident enough sometimes to just move ahead. He just feels that he's got to continue to punch down and belittle people when there's no need for it.
Again, as a consultant, I often had clients, CEOs particularly, who kind of fit your description. They were basically very insecure people, and they overcompensated for it by the way they treated other people, mistreated other people, and the people that they chose to bring in close, but not for very long.
Right.
Take a look, I don't know if you want to get involved in this, but take a look at the array of Democratic candidates. Do you see anybody there who's strong enough to take on Trump?
No, not really. I mean, the Democratic Party is in a bit of a free fall now. The Republican Party was in a free fall, and they've fallen, and they're not going to get up, at least for quite a while. The Republican Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of Donald Trump Incorporated. The Democratic Party does not know.
But that was not always the case. Certainly when he was elected, that was not the case.
But it is now because they fear him. They fear him. Members of Congress fear him for the sole reason that he is more popular in their states and in their districts than they are. And one tweet from him could be the end of your political career, and none of them are willing to risk that. The Democrats haven't quite figured out who they are yet or what they want to be. And this crazy system of electing presidents with caucuses and early primaries and things like that do not help any. So I think there were people who could have been very formidable opponents for Trump. But unfortunately, either they didn't enter the race or they've dropped out. So what's left, I'm not sure. I have a feeling that right now, and as we speak, we're on the verge of the of the New Hampshire primary. If Sanders happens to be the nominee of the party, people will go into November thinking, how did we get to this point? If I'm a Democrat, I'm thinking, how did we nominate a socialist as our candidate? If I'm a former Republican, I look at Trump and say, how did we get to this point? So unless the parties together with the states fix the presidential nominating process, we're going to continue to have this kind of chaos for the foreseeable future.
What about Bloomberg? Suppose he really steps into the race, not just with his money, but as whatever his platform is, or might
Well,
become.
I mean, unlike a lot of some of the candidates, like Mayor Pete from South Bend, he's a mayor of a small town. He was never a legislator, so he has no voting record. And he doesn't have much of a record as a mayor because he's only been there for one term or two terms.
You just described Obama.
Obama was a separate case. He was kind of the bright, shiny object for the Democratic Party.
Yes.
Nobody in the party had seen anybody like him before. And he was able to skate in a way that he kind of projected onto people what they wanted to think.
Yes.
And he was really a master politician that way. But the Democratic Party today does not know what it wants to be. I mean, if you go from Buttigieg to Sanders to Biden to Klobuchar to whoever, Bloomberg sort of stands out as an odd choice. But, you know, it could come to that. I mean, he has already surpassed some of the candidates in the polls just by virtue of his advertising. Not because he's entered any caucuses, not because he's been in any primaries. So he's advertising in states like Pennsylvania now and New Jersey, whose primaries are way off. So he could capture this if things go wrong for the candidates that are still in the race.
In many ways, he fits the same profile as Trump.
In what way?
His personality. He's got a very dominant personality.
But he's not
been accustomed because he grew that magnificent company of his almost single-handedly.
He came out of the corporate world, but look what he's built. And he's built it in an honest way. I don't begrudge him for that or his wealth. And he's not, and he was mayor of New York City for 8 years, so he has a record. He was never a legislator, but he has a record. Now, if you're going to be the mayor of the largest city in the United States for 8 years and get reelected once in the middle of that, you've got to be doing something right. You have to work with your city council, which he did in New York, which was a Democratic city council. He had to work with Democratic governors in New York State. I'd have a lot of confidence in Bloomberg, should he get that far. Question is, can he get that far?
But even while he was mayor, politically, you never were quite sure. He vacillated. He was conservative, and then he was liberal. He wasn't sure if he was going to run as an independent or as a Democrat, maybe even a Republican. He was very pragmatic in his approach.
He was pragmatic. I don't think he vacillated. Obviously, the issue of party identification is something that every candidate has to decide on. But I think in terms of his gut and in terms of the things he wanted to do, the things he didn't want to do, I think he was pretty clear along the way. I mean, again, you can't be elected and reelected in New York unless people buy into your program. And I think people at some point said, okay, I think there are things that you're doing that I like.
No, wait a minute. I don't disagree with you, I think, up to a point. A Republican could never become mayor of New York.
John Lindsay?
That was a different era.
Well, I'm just saying, John Lindsay, Rudy Giuliani, Bloomberg. I mean, you can be. Doesn't matter. You just made the point that you can't be. If Bloomberg could not be mayor of New York today as a Republican, because the Republican brand is damaged, and he'd have to live with that. So yeah, he was a Democrat. He was an independent, but he, as a governing individual, I don't think he's changed very much. I think he has a vision. He's articulate. He can tell you exactly what he'd like to do, and besides, he can tell you what he's already done. Yeah. And that counts for something. And people in New York, they may not love him. I mean, people were unhappy with his stop and frisk and some of the other things. But listen, you can't be a politician at that level unless you're going to make some people unhappy. He's already walked that back a little bit. But again, like you said, it was a different time, a different era. But today, I think people are looking for somebody who's a lot more genuine. And whether any of the candidates today fit that bill, I don't know. The Democrats are really in trouble because they haven't figured out what they want to be yet. I think Bloomberg knows what he is, and I don't think he's going to change.
Again, as we sit here, we have 14 reasons to be pessimistic about the near term of our country and our politics. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice again. You grew up, as you were growing up in Washington, working with the senator. There was a civility. Noonan touches on it.
Yeah.
There was a code, there was a standard, there was some expectation of how you were supposed to behave when you presented yourself as a representative of the people. Do you think we'll ever get back to that? Do you think we can ever get back to that, given the way our culture has developed, new generation, 2 new generations coming up very, very quickly? Do you think we'll ever get to the point where we enjoy that kind of civility so that there can be civil discourse, strong disagreement, but civil discourse?
The optimist in me, and I really do try to be optimistic about this, is that this Trump era will pass. And I don't see anybody on the horizon that is another Trump. I think it will be very difficult to become another Trump. He's really one of a kind. Now, if any Democrat is elected, even Bernie Sanders to some extent, there will be a different tone set. And maybe that will do it. If the Republicans lose in November, lose the House, lose the Senate, lose the White House, that may be the shock to their system that they need. That's what happened in 1964 when Goldwater lost. The Republican Party regrouped and said, okay, what do we want to be? Now, if you think back to 66, you had a number of moderate Republican senators who were elected. Chuck Percy from Illinois, Mark Hatfield from Oregon. I mean, I'm going back a long way.
You're bringing back some names.
Right. So, I mean, so it can happen. So unless the Republican Party gets a shock to its system and says, okay, wake up, you know, I don't see much changing. But it would take a shock to the system. The longer the party goes on the way they are, and the next term, if it's a Trump term, makes it much more difficult to go back to this civility. Joe Biden was criticized heavily because he talked about how in Washington he was able to work with Southern Democrats. Well, in those days, there was no sunshine laws. They used to meet in private to mark up bills and all the rest. And Senator Scott and Joe Biden were on the Judiciary Committee together. And guess who was the chairman? It was James Eastland from Mississippi, one of the arch segregationists. Well, to see them sit around the table and joke with each other and talk to each other and work through bills together, I mean, it was a sight to behold. And then they'd go out on the floor and they'd fight. But then they go back in the back room and they sit down and they work things out. That's the way it used to be. Republicans and Democrats did get along. There were no enemies the way you have today. Republicans and Democrats today don't talk to each other. Hugh Scott and Mike Mansfield, who was the majority leader at the time, were good friends. They were both veterans of the Second World War. They were both Asian scholars. They were both students of the Senate and of Congress. You couldn't have found two better gentlemen to work together. You don't see that today with McConnell and Schumer.
No.
They barely speak to each other. That's not a good way to govern.
Yeah. Oh, well. As I said at the beginning, your article caught my attention, pulled me up short, made me think a bit more about my own assessment of this presidency and where we are. I'm concerned about my kids, my grandkids, and now my great-grandkids. What kind of country, what kind of world. There's so many different variables now. And just as it may be almost impossible for any single person to manage a large city, New York, Philadelphia, and so on, today, it may be impossible for anyone, any human being, to manage this country and be a world leader.
It's
in
difficult.
The chaos we have now around the world.
No question, it is difficult to govern this country. I was reminded of what somebody once said about Charles de Gaulle. I mean, how do you govern a country that makes 200 kinds of cheese? It's very, very difficult. I mean, you have to be a master psychologist, politician, everything else to try to, thread the needle. Right now, I don't see him doing that. And if he is reelected, I don't see him doing it in his last 4 years because he'll be more untethered and unmoored than he is currently.
He's not capable of it.
The only thing that could be a check on that, and we're not even sure there, is the court system. Despite his bluster and all of that, he's lost a lot of cases in court. That's about the only last resort that we have, because if the House stays Republican, if the House stays Democrat, and the Senate stays Republican, you're going to continue to have this deadlock and gridlock for the next 4 years.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Exploring.
Nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We can all hope for the best.
Hope so. Thank you.
My guest today has been Ken Davis, who is a friend of the station and is an expert in politics. Until next time, this is 30 Minutes. Take very good care of yourselves.